the bulk of what I've read from Hegel, though I did try to read Phenomenology of the Spirit like years ago. I gave up. I was like, this isn't for me. It's too much. I was right after I read Capital too, and I'm like, no, I need to walk back. But a lot of what I've read from Hegel is from secondary sources, right? It's people writing about Hegel, quoting him, and it's always hard to see what this is in the macro sense for Hegel's work. Robert Beale's book, Eurocentrism and the Communist Movement, and Kevin B. Anderson's book, Marx at the Margins, they quote Hegel a few times, specifically about Africa. And if I can, I know you have a bunch of quotes too, probably, but just so I can as well. Hegel speaks of North Africa as, quote, a land which does nothing but follow the fate of all which arrives from the great beyond, lacking a definite face of its own. Turn like Asia Minor towards Europe. This part of Africa could and should be attached to Europe. And then Kevin B. Anderson talks about Hegel's views on India and his dismissiveness of India, and how it should also be subjected by Europeans. And there's this Eurocentric track within Hegel that when I read Marxist critiques of the movement, Hegel seems to be that starting point for those critiques as well. That Hegel is this contradictory factor of Hegel is both the foundation of Marxism in a lot of ways, but also a lot of the deviations within Marxism. What's your view on Hegel's Eurocentrisms, and also how that has played into Marxist movements and schools of thought, and maybe making, whether it's theoretical mistakes or practical mistakes in the last, 150, 200 years?
So as for the second question, I think you're going to know a lot more about that than me, because I am a philosopher. I'm not, a historian, or, my knowledge of the history of Marxist movements is pretty low compared to a lot of people who are, very active in organizing, things like that. So I'm not sure I can answer that question, but I can at least answer the question about Hegel himself. And I think beforehand, it's worth to talk about, we need to have different levels of analysis for this question. Cause I've read Conscientism by Nkrumah recently, and he talks a lot about how he approaches the history of philosophy versus how people who are kind of sucking up to the European ideal approach it, and Europeans themselves approach it. And the standpoint that a Eurocentric approaches the history of philosophy is that these are great people, these are great heroes, these are cultural symbols of European whatever superiority kind of thing, right? And so if one adopts that perspective, then it's oh, well, Hegel can do no wrong because he's the great Hegel, and anybody's trying to just bash him because he was a product of his times, blah, 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 right? And then you have the other side, which is let's destroy this fucker, right? Of trying to bash the cultural icon, right? Right? And so, and what Nkrumah recommends is, he says, what we should do is we should situate these people in their own histories and see what decisions they made based on the political battles of the time and where they fit into that. And then, you can figure out how you can situate yourself into your own times. That's if you're not doing this for the standpoint of waging a war about culture and these figures as cultural icons. So let me just start by saying that Hegel's philosophy is incredibly Eurocentric, especially his philosophy of history. And it's weird. I was talking to some people about this the other day. There used to be this conventional advice. It's oh, you want to read Hegel? Start with his philosophy of history. I'm why are you recommending the most fucking racist? It's Hegel at his worst, why would you recommend this to people? Are you and it's not they're trying to turn these people off from Hegel. You're just trying to make all Hegelians into a bunch of racists then? Or is that the plan here? Or there's some stuff, and it's not the whole book is just, full, there are parts of the book that are not just connected to this, but it's very strange because the book is a very Eurocentric version of history. So I don't know why people recommend that as the starting point. Generally speaking, Hegel views history with a presupposition, which is that history is the unfolding of freedom. He understands freedom dialectically, meaning that he's not just saying like, okay, are you this much free or that much free, or like, like what's the level of freedom, but he wants to locate where the freedom is in each society. And so the way he sees it is that it goes from one man is free, some men are free, and all men are free, which he associates with three different cultures: Asiatic, Greek, and finally European, or at least he would hope European, because right, he's still living under a monarchy and things like that. But so there is a conceptual movement here that he sees as unfolding from east to west, beginning with like Oriental despotism and then Greek democracy, which is, of course, right, this gets roped into this European narrative, which, even Hegel recognizes this was not freedom for everyone. It was freedom for a group of people. So it wasn't a true democracy because there was slavery and all these things. And finally ending with what he sees as the promise of like liberal revolutions in Europe. So now Hegel, for reasons you just like mentioned, has a strange Eurocentrism. And I'm sure that like experts on Orientalism, like in the bad sense, like people like, Said or people in that tradition know a lot more about the history of this stuff than I do. But it seems strange to me that he incorporates like North Africa and parts of Asia into Europe, the greater Europe. And, there's a long like history of like the French like trying to pretend that like Egyptians were white, right? And things like this, right? So there is like a precedent here. And Hegel seems to view things, geographical areas, as becoming historical only when they come in contact with Europe, which is pretty much the way that we're also still like trained to think Eurocentrically in our own like settler education, right? We hear that Columbus discovered America. It's like, well, weren't there people here who knew that there was a like right? That's like inherently like things become historical when they come in contact with Europe. Hegel also emphasizes Christianity is particularly important in history because he sees in Christianity an idea of freedom. There's neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female. And then he thinks that the concept of the Trinity is particularly dialectical, right? Father and Son, God and man united and one, right? So there's something, he thinks that like the philosophical problem of the Trinity was particularly important and dialectical. But if you situate Hegel himself within other people from his time period, so like Hegel is 100% a racist by what we mean when we say someone is a racist today. And I think, though, if we were to be strict about it, Hegel is more of a culturally ethnocentric, because during this time, racial pseudoscience is really floating around, right? Like Kant especially is developing theories of like race. And Hegel does talk about these theories in the encyclopedia, the different racial theories. Just because Hegel, of course, talks about a theory doesn't mean he endorses it. Like he also talks about astrology and phrenology and physiognomy, which he all rejects. And his critique actually of phrenology, the racist skull science, is quite good. It still actually holds up, and I think you could actually develop it into a kind of dialectical critique of like, what is it? Is it the bell curve? Is that the name of the horrible book? Right? Or like DNA, any kind of genetic basis for anything like that. Yeah, like it's a good critique of any kind of genetic deterministic eugenic kind of basis already. Because he's the philosopher of freedom at the same time. So when he discusses race, he actually says at the beginning that like a lot of people put a lot of stock into racial differences, and he says that the reason they do it is because they hope to prove that one race is like naturally superior to the others so that they can dominate the so-called lesser races. And he said this is like an affront to freedom, right? So there is a sense in which Hegel, although he will talk about race, rejects the idea that race can be used as a basis for denying people freedom. And I think that is a progressive point on his time. And because he says that all people are rational, even implicitly so, right? So even if like, right, like from his point of view, like he would be reading all of these like really racist anthropologists and stuff, and he's like, so even if these people like don't display reason, they're at least implicitly rational, and so this gives them some dignity. But yeah, as far as like how he tries to explain racial differences in the encyclopedia, he looks at geography weirdly, which is like reminiscent of Marx. And then yeah, I mean, he just like, I mean, you read it and it fits into he fits into a lot of the colonial narratives. And you know, it would be interesting if you wanted to like really know, like, is Hegel doing this out of being malicious, or is he doing it because he was, you know, ignorant of anything else? It would be interesting to see what he had access to when a lot of the studies on Native American culture and language were being published, because they were published at the University of Berlin, so he probably would have eventually had access to them. There is this whole argument from Susan Buck Morris about Hegel and the Haitian Revolution. I don't know if you've come across this.
No, I have not. I'm intrigued.
Yeah, so I always thought that this was kind of wishful thinking, but basically the argument. So one of the most famous parts of the phenomenology of spirit is Hegel's master-slave dialectic, and there's an idea. This idea is that there are two people vying for recognition, striving to have their like humanity, you could say, recognized, their right to being their claim of certainty, you could say, is how we would put it. But they engage in this life and death struggle. One person submits, one person doesn't flinch. The person who submits becomes the slave. Then the master becomes the dominant one. The slave goes to work for the master. And in this time, Hegel points out that there's this, in this imbalanced relationship, the master lacks all certainty about themselves, because to have certainty about yourself, you have to know yourself through the lens of another person. But when someone is your subordinate, they can't tell you anything that you can really believe, right? Like they're sucking up to you, right? And so true self-consciousness is achieved from the standpoint of the slave, who knows what reality is. They have to work on it. Like they're the one who knows what this real relationship is, but they lack power. And so there's a sense in which like the Hegelian dialectic continues at this pivotal moment between the first time there are two minds that meet each other. And it continues from the standpoint of the slave thinking about the situation of slavery. And so I've always thought that this mainly comes from his idea that the French treat their servants better than the Germans. I don't know if that was true, but that was his impression from like French literature. And then his shitty situation as a tutor. But Susan Buck Morris argues that the Haitian, he read about the Haitian Revolution and that this was part of the inspiration. And while I'm not sure how, you know, it's this paper cited a lot, and why I would want to go back and reread it. Something I did notice in his philosophy of history, as he talks about, you know, he says something that is I think rather racist, where he says that, you know, Black people don't have the same level of respect for life as Europeans. But he gives us an example, which he praises as courageous: thousands of unarmed Black men courageously charging into the line of fire into a European army. That's Haiti. Because in the Haitian Revolution, the slaves didn't have guns, so they just had to rush, just getting gunned down until they could grab guns for themselves and fight. And I talked to one of my friends who knows this history really well, and he's also a German idealist scholar. And I was like, I showed him the passage. He's like, yeah, that's Haiti. That's Haiti for sure. And so there is a sense maybe in which there's another line too where Hegel says something about like, and this again is, you know, it's a Eurocentric way of thinking, where he says that like he says that Haiti is set up as a Christian republic, and he says, see, this shows that there is innate intelligence in Black people, right? Which is awful, but he at least doesn't. He's trying, you know what I mean? So he's kind of like an ignorantly racist motherfucker at times, right? It's awful, right?
Hegel is definitely like the epitome of like the contradictions within like early Marxism, right? Of like
He really is. He really is.
He's born from the Holy Roman Empire, Germany, a latecomer to the colonial scene. Like he's around when all this shit's happening. And then you have the French Revolution, which changes everything in the European mindset, right? And then Haiti is only a couple years after that starts. So that changes the world dynamic. So, I mean, I'm not surprised a guy like Hegel, who loved the French Revolution, like he really identified with that, also identified with the Haitian Revolution. but then he's still stuck being a guy born in 1770. So like because early Marx, like you read stuff from Marx and you get like racist stuff. You do get it every once in a while from Engels, especially. You do get it every once in a while. So it's not like I definitely understand like these are men product of their times. So I'm always looking for that kernel within the theory that is revolutionary. You know, like you mentioned Walter Rodney. Walter Rodney talks about how classes have. He might be talking purely about like the petty bourgeoisie, but he talked about how certain classes have like a dual revolutionary and reactionary tendency. And I see that also with like no offense, but like academia. Like when we get to like academia that's of the left, it carries with it this dual character of revolutionary tendencies and reactionary tendencies, just due to the environment that they're in. You know, Hegel, like all academics, he's around the cultural elite, so to speak. You know, he may not be the bourgeoisie, but he's around the bourgeoisie in a way that a regular proletariat or a lumpen proletariat is not, right? So to me, it's fascinating. Like Hegel, to me, is this epitome of this dual revolutionary and reactionary character that a lot of different people or classes carry.
Yeah, and like one of the big things, like one of the big like litmus tests for ignorant motherfuckers who maybe didn't harbor ill will, is like the issue of slavery, right? And like on that issue, I think that's when like it's like, okay, maybe Marx said some things, but like his heart was with the black struggle, right? Like he was an abolitionist. Hegel, not so much. Hegel was absolutely anti-slavery, but he was not an abolitionist. He was a reformist. And one thing I will give him credit for is that he says that what he perceives as cultural inferiority in people of African descent, he says that is a product of slavery. He said, so instead of saying, like most colonial apologists, that so-called inferiority is a justification that allows for slavery, his claim is that no, slavery is the condition that has produced, in Rodney's sense, underdevelopment, right? Now, then he gets into this like, okay, but one has to make oneself worthy of freedom kind of statement, and one wonders what he thinks by that. Sometimes he's weird and dialectical about certain claims where he's trying to like give this idea of like, oh, you have to like take up arms and like fight for your freedom to like really like get it. So you could take a Fanonian reading to it. It all is probably more just him thinking along typical racist European lines, right? His view of indigenous people is really, really bad compared to, it's even worse than with black people, which is surprising. I was like, I didn't realize that someone back then would even think so horribly of indigenous people, even more so. I guess it does make sense. It would be interesting to know what information he had, because all reports coming back from the Americas about indigenous people are being written by colonizers. So, he shouldn't have thought these things for sure. There's no excuse for it. But one wonders, where he would line up compared to, if you read some of the people that like say they're cites, right, who are, Orientalists or whatnot. So that's like, I think where Hegel like fits into his own times. Like there's the question too of like is like Eurocentrism like is an inherent part of Hegelian philosophy, or can it be separated from it? Hegel, like when he talks about what he characterizes as like the people character of like European, specifically Caucasian people, he describes them in terms of like reason understood in a very dialectical and Hegelian sense of like, because he sees reason and freedom as both kind of like thought determining itself, if that makes sense. And so, one could make the claim that like, oh, so like Hegelian reason is like this inherently Eurocentric thing. And I'm not sure if I buy that. I think it's more that like Hegel was Eurocentric. And so he said that, oh, so then of course, like Europeans have the reason thing, right? So I think when we get to his history and the way he like lines up the peoples and all of that, I mean, it's in the orbit of Europe. It's in the orbit of European ideas. One thing I would say about how it's taken up today by Marxists is I think when we read these sections of Hegel, what we're reading them to learn about, unless we're just interested in Hegel biography for some reason, I think is primarily how colonial epistemology is set up, right? Because Hegel's like the progressive end of colonial epistemology. He's like we're just bringing freedom and culture end of colonialism. Not the not like he's like the softer stick of colonialism epistemology wise, right? And so I think we need to read him along those ends, which is how different than how we would read the phenomenology or logic. Maybe the phenomenology has a little bit of history in it, so there, but I'm not remembering anything particularly questionable in there off the top of my head. The logic might be something that could be separated a lot more, although you might be suspicious of his kind of Christian centrist views. But then what gets really problematic is when people take up these positions today. So I think about, so Hegel associates Europe with Christianity. He associates European values and European freedom with Christianity. And I think about someone, and I just dropped my earbud all the way across the room.
No worries.
All right. I think about someone like Zizek, right? So Zizek repeats this move of like Hegelian Christian atheism. And I think it's precisely he uses it precisely to affirm Christian values as somehow inherently European, right? And he's somebody who claims to be a Marxist. My teacher, Gabriel Rockhill, might have some disagreements with that claim. But he's somebody who, wears the mantle of Marxism, who calls for a return to Christian atheism, a la Hegel. And I think that those aspects of Hegel are very easily mobilized into turning our tradition into a very Eurocentric tradition. So that's what I would say about that angle about it. That like if we take up Hegel in our own time and take up these positions of Hegel again in our own time, they're even more nefarious than they were. Where if we look at Hegel within his own context and we see he's somewhere like maybe left of center in regards to like these different struggles, where Marx would be someone on the far left, right? Mm-hmm. They've become even worse with age. Let's just put it that way. Like and Zizek saying not when Christianity, Hegel's views of Christianity, where he is trying to demythologize it a little bit and like kind of try to turn it into a kind of ideology that can be used to promote the French revolutionary ideas. When Zizek does that today in Europe, in the context of like refugees coming in, that's like horrific. That's way worse. So that's something where I think Hegel should be both criticized and like we should be really suspicious whenever someone wants to weaponize those aspects of Hegel in our tradition, if that makes sense.
I absolutely agree. And, mentioning that, obviously check out Western Marxism, edited by Gabriel Rockhill, by Domenico Lasordo, because there's like a whole chapter on Zizek, and it's probably my favorite chapter of it, to be quite honest.